How's things, Mark? You doing okay?
Yeah, very well. Yeah, just getting used to the remote working. It's been what 16 months now, I think.
Yeah.
I've been into the office. Well, actually into the office once in that time. Been in the car park basement 3 times, but I've been in the office once. So it's a very different um, set of working arrangements than I'm used to. How about everyone else? Are you all working remotely as well?
I think this is the way it's going to stay now, isn't it? To a certain extent, I think we've all proved that we can do it, and I'm not sure it's going to be the same when we do get back to normal in this world.
No, no. Well, we've taken a decision as an authority pretty much now that this is what we're doing going forward.
Yeah.
I think most other authorities are doing something similar. So
Yeah, we're looking at new offices ourselves at the moment, and it's actually not an easy decision. It's not an easy decision. You certainly need some level of collaboration space, but traditional office, I'm not so sure. But we'll wait and see. Yeah, got a little while yet.
Yeah, I think we are creating a number of collaborative spaces within our remaining sort of properties. So I think we'll be desks plus collaborative space. Should be interesting, be good.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a change. It's a change. Hybrid working, but we will wait and see.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for joining, everybody who has. We're just giving it a couple more minutes before we start the proceedings on this particular session. So if you bear with us, chat amongst yourselves, etc., etc. How are you doing, Mr. Finch? You all sorted there? You working from home?
Working from home, we're just saying, I've not been back to the office for over 12 months. So it's all been remote working, so it's just as effective for me, so can't complain.
Yeah, we haven't been in an office since 2 weeks before initial lockdown, and I have to say it hasn't made a blind bit of difference to us. In fact, I would go as far as saying is actually staff happiness and productivity have both quite dramatically increased. So go figure, guys. That's a question for another session. Maybe we'll do that. I don't know if it's relevant, how relevant it is to telecare and health tech, but well-being is relevant, isn't it? We should all have a well-being button, shouldn't we, beside us now, saying I'm very well working from home. But there we go. Right, guys, we'll get moving. Thanks everybody for joining, and I'm sure there's going to be others joining as we go. But as I said earlier on, we've got a bit of a tight schedule today, so we're going to move forward. Particular welcome to our 4 panel members: Paul Shead from Innovation Group, Mark Allen from Hampshire County Council, Paul Finch from the TSA, and Grant, our very own Grant Tiller, Product Development Director of Yorbl. This is an interesting subject and an oft emotive one, which a lot of interesting questions are being asked. I think views about are things outdated, what do they actually do for us in terms of standards, and it is that question: are they standards or barriers? So I'm going to kick this session off with a question to Grant, actually. Given that one of the issues that's been mentioned to me regularly by various customers and colleagues in the industry is that standards are outdated and not updated regularly enough to stay abreast of new technologies and relevant to new technologies. What is your opinion? Because we're just having one that's coming through as the 50134.5 as just going through ratification now. That's the first time that's been updated, I think, and I will be corrected rapidly if I'm wrong, since 2005. So that's a long time. It's a millennium in technology terms. But you've had a chance, I believe, now to read through that, Grant, and look through it. that standard specifically is for social systems, social alarm systems, interconnections and communications. How relevant do you think it is? You know, that is just updated. What's your views on that?
Yeah, it's a weird one for me, and I'm fairly new to this industry. You know, I worked previously in the enterprise space and really wasn't working in the sort of boundaries and confines that we have in sort of telecare and healthcare in general, actually. And initially, I was a little bit bewildered, to be honest with you, by having to kind of think in this sort of, I mean, we refer to it as a legacy mindset, but you know, the standards were created for a reason. And that was to provide a reliable and robust service that can be depended on. And you know, yes, it was last updated in 2004, but I think you know the update that we're seeing coming in now shows that as technology is changing, as new technology is coming in, and particularly around you know connectivity, so you know the Wi-Fi technologies, Bluetooth technologies, as well as the analog to digital change that we covered previously in the last session, you know, shows that in general, telecare is moving forwards. As to the question as to whether or not we're doing enough fast enough, you know, bear in mind that these standards are a set of recommendations. And you know, we can talk about this with the guys. I think it'd be useful to cover during this session. They are recommendations, that they're not standards that must be, you know, stringently adhered to. It's a list of recommendations to look at as you're choosing a solution, and also from our perspective as we're developing a solution. You know, we need to reference this document and make sure that we're ticking the boxes to make sure that you know the technology we're building moving forwards is robust.
Okay, thanks. I mean, Mark, from the perspective of an organisation that procures this technology, and how do you see these services and standards? Do you see them as something that promotes or perhaps stymies innovation and development?
It depends how they're applied. I think as a commissioner and somebody who does, not personally, but pays for a range of services, I think standards are tools to be used, but they shouldn't be, as you've rightly said, in these barriers to innovation and service delivery. So they need to reflect the sort of, I mean, we work in, my area is social care. So, you know, we deliver services to the most vulnerable citizens in our society. People who live in their own homes, who are reliant on us to ensure that there's safe and reliable services. So there is a level to which we need to ensure that the services that we procure, and I'm not a technology expert, I work in social care, I'm an expert in welfare services, social care services. So I need something that enables me to fairly quickly understand the sorts of services that are going to be delivered through the procurement. So it's a shortcut for us to understand that there's a level of safety and all the rest of it. But what we cannot see, and absolutely cannot see, is as standards or regulations barring us from actually developing innovative approaches to care delivery. So there is a bit of a balancing act to be had here. My worry is, and it is a worry about just the approach of technology in general from social care, is that the technology becomes the thing that people look at rather than the service delivery and the defined definition of outcomes. So I think there's this issue of this concept of a balancing act between understanding what the sort of standards you would expect to see are and that should be in place, combined with my ambition as a social care professional, wanting to see service delivery, you know, being innovative, actually meeting people's needs. I think we also need to recognise as we go forward that the sorts of services that we've delivered up to now, where we've been very standalone, yes, you can see the idea of having, you know, standards that meet certain criteria and all the rest of it, but we're starting to see the emergence of blended services where people use their own technologies as well as the technologies that we might supply as an organisation. I think there you start to get into a fairly interesting conversation about how do you mix in this issue of standards with something that somebody's already got, and they don't give a monkeys about the standards. They're going to use it because it works for them. And I think there's an interesting debate there. Probably haven't had enough of, either locally or nationally, about how we start to integrate these things into people's own lives. There's a lot of discussion about integration between organisations, between health and social care, and that interoperability issue and all the rest of it, and the standards to have that. But what about people? What about Mrs. Smith, who wants to use her Alexa or her laptop with the lifeline that she gets and all of that? And how do we actually ever go about doing it?
Well, I think we mustn't, thank you for that, Mark. I think we mustn't ever forget that we're talking about technology, we're talking about digital, but this is all about services delivered to often vulnerable people, and it's their needs that matter and will always matter. And I also think it's about pragmatism. It's about what the reality is. Paul, Finch, TSA, what do you feel is your responsibility as an organisation in terms of how these standards are developed, how they answer and speak to the needs that Mark has just been articulating? So
I think for TSA as a body that represents the sector is a key role to play here. And it's one of the things we try and do through our programme board and the special interest groups is disseminate the information that we're seeing coming from the standards bodies. We do represent the UK on BSI committees and some of the other European committees. So it's important for us to make sure that the members of TSA get information around the standards and the proposed changes, but also take the feedback from the organisations and the members and wider stakeholders to make sure that those views are represented at the committees. So for that particular one you're talking about, they do take a while to change, but we understand it's the process. It's a long-winded process in making sure that standard is applicable across Europe. So part of our job is to make sure that what some of the Europeans are proposing within the standard fits the industry here in the UK, and vice versa, that we can influence how the standards are shaped moving forward to make sure that the UK view and the UK requirements are considered within those standards. So it's an important role and one that we take seriously.
Do you think Brexit's going to have an impact on that?
It will have some impact, but it's already been decided that most of the European standards will become adopted as UK standards. Mm-hmm. So that and the involvement we have through BSI will still continue to be a recognised member of the European standards boards. So that representation will continue for the foreseeable future.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Shead, you were involved in the going back a fair few years now, but involved in the production of these standards at I think early days, if I'm correct. And
yeah, so back in the mid-90s, 95, we started work on EN 50134, the social alarm standards, and really they've not changed in any significant way since then. And you mentioned earlier, Peter, about the age of the interconnections and communications part 5 of EN 50134. That's out for comment now, but as you said, the previous version was 2004. If you look at the oldest of the standards, the system requirements for social alarms part 1, that dates back to 2002 and hasn't been reviewed and isn't up for comment at the moment. So as you can imagine, it's well out of date in terms of current technologies.
So how do you think, given that people, in Mark's position should view these? How should they look at them when they're selecting technology, looking at technology, looking at how to deliver those all-important services?
Yeah, it's pretty difficult for commissioners and for suppliers of services to navigate this. If you look at the two types of standards, the product standards, like how do you build a social alarm, what should it do, what fault should it detect, all of that kind of thing around the product itself are certainly outdated. And if you don't want to buy a traditional analog alarm and you want to buy a modern digital alarm, you have to be very careful about specifying compliance to the whole standard. One way of tackling it may be to pull out key parts of those standards and refer only to clauses within the standards, because as soon as you refer to the whole standard, also all the normative references kick in from other sets of standards, so that they're part of complying with EN 50134. So it's a bit of a minefield, but the scope for 50134 is defined very clearly. As a minimum, it contains some kind of trigger, so a portable pendant or a smoke detector or some other activation sensor. Then it contains a local unit and controller. So the local unit provides some kind of speech capability to the user. The controller then coordinates all of this and communicates to an ARC or an alarm receiving center. If you don't have those components, it's not a social alarm. If you don't have speech, it's not a social alarm. So I think it's we need to be very careful about how we define these standards and in what context. And there's a lot of IoT services coming in now that are nothing to do with speech. There's no speech connection. It's just some data being transmitted to either a next of kin on an app or to an alarm receiving center. So I think there's maybe not a good deal of clarity of understanding amongst purchasing generally across the UK about what should they actually specify. And maybe that's an opening for the TSA to provide some guidance to procurement departments about what they should and shouldn't specify.
I think to your point, you know, the speech element is an important one as well when you're looking at consumer electronics. You know, everyone is now, even the older generation, you know, they're familiar with Alexa and how it behaves. And, you know, there's billions of dollars being put into building an advanced neural network and the back end behind it. However, if you ask Alexa for help, then the likelihood is you're going to get an instruction manual for a 3 Series BMW. It's not along the lines of the stuff that we're focused on, you know, providing to vulnerable people that are not necessarily as tech savvy as we are. And that building a product, for me, that is a real concern moving forward as we start to look at consumer electronics and being asked by customers to introduce that into our portfolio.
Just one thing.
There's, I mean, looking at this and looking at what Paul Finch, looking at what Paul Shead said earlier in some of the other comments, there's a concern I hear, and I'm going to be quite open and honest about this, and I hear on a regular basis about standards that perhaps they're driven as much by the commercial concerns of the main players, the traditional players in the industry, as they are by a genuine need for real quality control. Again, what's your views, the TSA's views on that?
From our point of view, we don't see that internally. We don't see outside influence through driving the standards in that way. We do recognise that some of the European standards take an age to revise and review and bring up to date, if you like. So we put process in place to try and help drive those standards forward. I mentioned already the program board and the special interest groups that we have, and we're already working on some of those interoperability aspects. So within our own, what would be seen as a proprietary set of standards or the quality standards framework, we're already working to try and introduce those interoperability elements into the framework. Because our framework is more agile, it can respond to change and demand more quickly, then we can influence that change more quickly. From our point of view, it's important to make sure that the industry experts are utilised to help drive those standards. So Paul, Shead and others represent the industry on those special interest groups to help drive the standards forward. But then as a UCAS accredited certification body, we have our own methodologies to make sure that those recommendations of standards are kept impartial. We have an impartiality committee and we have our own board of directors as part of Tech Quality Limited, which is the standard certification body, to make sure that whatever we do is a completely impartial and agnostic approach to the setting of standards. So there are opportunities within TSA and within the standard setting that we have on board to try and bring those standards changes more quickly.
Absolutely. Do you see, I mean, Paul Shead also said about the commissioners looking at using parts or quoting parts of the standards when they're going out to tender or looking to purchase. Do you see the TSA applying that same approach in terms of your own tech quality and the standards you apply?
I think Mark would agree with me here that there are some procurement standards required, some service specification type standards that are needed, and that's something that we're looking at the moment. I think the commissioners need to be able to hang their hat on something. So if they're able to quote a standard, it's easy to be able to say, well, I know this equipment's safe because it complies with these standards. Sort of quoting sections from a standard implies that the commissioner needs to understand more detail about the standard, which is then something they have to purchase. But part of our role as part of TSA is to help guide organisations through that process. So we will support organisations if they are putting specifications together through that membership approach, so that we can help them and make sure that they're getting the right product and the right services.
And you'll support them in taking the type of approach Paul's suggesting.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay.
I think that's an important aspect. I think, if you look at 50134, it's a very detailed document, and there's elements of it that haven't been updated for what feels like a lifetime technically. I think it's important, as you're going through product selection, is be able to treat that as almost a la carte. Go through it and look at the bits that are must-haves for you in your deployment. I think if you stringently stick to every part of the document, you're going to end up deploying a solution that doesn't give the best care. It doesn't give the best functionality, and it's probably not going to give you longevity when you deploy it, because you are encompassing standards and functionality that simply aren't required right now or into the future.
Just one thing to add to that, I think there are some social alarm standards that are still very applicable, and that's around the signalling protocols for IP. So if you look at part 9 of 50134 and also part 2 of BS 8521, I think they both still have a very important role, because they make sure that sensor types are communicated correctly to the alarm receiving center. Is it a smoke detector? Is it a fall detector? And so on. And also they establish a reliable speech connection as part of that protocol, that signaling protocol. But again, that's involving speech always in these calls. So if you've got IoT devices that don't involve speech, then there is no necessity to look at those standards. But for traditional telecare monitoring with life critical services, I think they've still got a huge role to play.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on that, Mark?
It's interesting, because I think the discussion around particular standards it's where do I as a commissioner need to position myself to understand how we commission a service that will deliver for our citizens. And I come across people who want to get into the whole detail of the standards and buy a specific bit of kit.
Line by line.
Line by line. And then on the other side of it, there's people who haven't got a clue and they'll just buy anything. And then there's people like me, probably in the middle, that I'm very much outcomes focused, and which is why the approach we've taken is to develop a partnership with an organisation that trusts. We've also worked very closely with TSA, because the TSA standards are the sorts of things as a commissioner we can start to hang our hat on. They're understandable, they're written in sort of plain English. They're not sort of standardese and all that sort of stuff. But the truth of the matter is as a commissioner, we need what I'm concerned is the types of outcomes that are delivered, and are we able to do that in a safe way and a clear way? I think even more nowadays, and I think Paul and both Pauls and Grant have pointed out that there are a lot more technologies that are coming onto the market. And, quite frankly, some of those are snake oil salesmen that are trying to sell something they've knocked up in their shed over the weekend. And we do need a way to stop that happening, because there is danger in that. But what we can't do, and what I really fight against, is trying to make people who work in social care or other areas technology specialists, because we're not. We're never going to be able to do that. And that is why we do lean on the likes of the TSA and others to provide that support for us, in terms of ensuring that we can put that into our specification, that they need to meet particular standards that are understandable by us. But again, part of the thing that we're starting to look for, and a lot of authorities are starting to look for, is that sort of partnership approach, where we're not buying specific bits of kit. what we're buying is particular outcomes, particular levels of safety, particular levels of service delivery, particular levels of reliability, those sorts of things. And then the standards are up to guys like you who really understand them in a way that I never would, to be able to deliver them effectively. And we need, between us, with the TSA, with manufacturers, with providers of services, to develop systems that enable us to do that in a safe, complete way. And my job is to monitor that.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, and I think it's that partnership, that collaboration is absolutely hugely important. I think particularly now, none of us are, you know, I'm not a mechanic, so I have to take my car and I have to take the advice of the people that I take my car to if my car goes wrong, or if I want a new car. Electricians, whatever you want to call it, we need that reliable, honest, and objective. And objective is a main word here, advice. And I think particularly at the moment, what you guys feel about this is a hugely important moment in terms of the development of not just telecare, but digital health and care, social services, the whole thing. We're at a stage where we have got no choice but to go digital. And my belief is if we don't do it properly, we could set everything back a decade, another 15 years. We have to have the ability to look at innovation, look at what technology can offer us to speak to those outcomes, Mark, to look at how we can benefit people's lives, how we can increase the quality of life, health, aging, the whole thing. And if we don't, there's so much opportunity with digital. If we don't, there's an opportunity not to do it properly or not to do it at all, where commissioners, for example, we used to say in IT and technology, nobody got sacked for buying IBM, or nobody got sacked for buying Cisco. And I'm sure there's a similar mentality in telecare amongst commissioners in certain, nobody got sacked for buying whatever. I won't go into that, but it's how do you, I mean, Mark, do you feel that we need to really take this whole situation very seriously and take that brave step at looking things a little bit deeper than we normally do now?
The answer to that's yes. I think that is happening. I mean, I work with the TSA quite often, and I know there's lots of discussions around the digital platforms and what that means. I don't think we've got the answers to that. The whole issue of the digital switch is the approach to it from some authorities, not people here, but authorities in terms of looking at it as a purely technical exercise of the analog gets switched off and digital happens, is sort of the wrong thing. That's an important part of it, but it's not the totality of the story. And what that does is it offers us a number of challenges and a number of opportunities. And what we need to do is collectively understand what they are and see what the possibilities are deriving from that. So if we're starting to collect information that flows through digital channels, we'll be collecting a lot more information. How do we start to use that effectively? What are the standards we use to collect that? What are the protocols we use for actually sharing that information, using it in terms of data and analytics and all the rest of it to understand what's happening with our clients and customers? The other thing is around the sorts of platforms and the devices, the technologies that people will start to offer. There is an issue there that moves way beyond lifelines and all the rest of it. The possibilities are endless. And for the likes of me is, what do we start to get into in that? I'll just give you a very brief example. We ran a pilot with the Alexa. We still use the Amazon Alexa. We thought we'd do all sorts of whizzy and wonderful things with it, which we did, but we got into the realms of actually data protection issues and where that data goes to. And it meant that actually what we could do with it was restricted. Now, there is an issue there that we have to address, which is about data and about how data flows about vulnerable people. It doesn't mean that the opportunity isn't there. It just means that the challenge is fairly significant. And that isn't about, a lifeline or anything like that. It's actually about people starting to think beyond the traditional services that we've offered, and that telecare for me is not really a word I recognise anymore. I'm not sure what we call it now. We call it text where I am, but it's probably beyond that now. And it really is a case of where do we go to next, and what do we use to make sure we can maintain safety, maintain personal integrity, but also deliver better outcomes for people. It's a real challenge, and those that are looking at it on a day-to-day basis, I do not envy them, I must say.
You know, thank you very much for those comments, Mark, because they speak very clearly to the next couple of sessions where we're going in terms of future-proofing services, looking quite clearly at data and looking at understanding the pros and cons of software versus hardware, of how we look at data in terms of security and personal ownership. There's all sorts of things that are coming up, which I hope everybody will find very interesting. I have to say I found that conversation very interesting. Thank you all very much indeed, and I hope all of the delegates got something out of that. As always, if you have any questions, feel free to fire them in. We have the Q&A session at the end of the day. We've got a bunch of questions in already, but we'll take more and get through as many as we can. So please send them in. Best way to send them in is to events@yorbl.com. With Q&A question in the subject line. So we're closing this session now. Thank you again very much indeed to everybody involved. Tremendously useful. The session video will be available within a couple of hours on various channels, which you'll be able to find either via YouTube. Look for Yorbl on YouTube or LinkedIn or Facebook. So until the next session, which is future-proofing your services. Last session before lunch. That starts at 12:10. Look forward to seeing you there. And thanks again, everybody. Thanks very much indeed.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the session. We'll give it a few minutes to let others join. I know that leaving the previous session, probably using the loo and getting a cup of tea before coming in. So we'll give them a couple of minutes, and I'll see you in a few ticks.
Hello, everyone that's still in standards or barriers. The next meeting, Future-Proofing Your Services, has begun. If you'd like to exit the canopy, exit to the canopy system and then rejoin the next meeting, please. Next meeting is Future-Proofing Your Services. Should be starting any minute now. I'm now going to close up this meeting and save the recording. Thank you very much.